It was a quiet Wednesday morning when Detective Mason sat at his desk, flipping through paperwork, with a disinterested sigh. The precinct had been relatively calm recently. Too calm, he thought. That's when she walked in. A woman, probably in her mid-30s, wearing simple clothes that seemed a little too plain for someone who might be dealing with something serious. She hesitated for a moment at the entrance, scanning the room, and then made her way toward the front desk. Detective Mason glanced up, then quickly looked away. She didn't look like she had anything important to report, just another random visitor, maybe another worried citizen with a wild claim. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice quiet but steady. "I'd like to report a crime." He couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. Another one of those, he thought. He was so used to people walking in with complaints about petty thefts, noise disturbances, or things that weren't worth investigating. So, he leaned back in his chair and gave her an uninterested look. "Go ahead. Tell me about this crime," he said, rolling his eyes. The woman didn't seem fazed by his lack of enthusiasm. She opened her mouth as if choosing her words carefully. There was something about her that caught his attention, but he quickly dismissed it. After all, she was just a regular citizen, right? How important could she possibly be? The woman continued, "There's been a series of break-ins happening in my neighborhood. I've seen some patterns. I think I know who the thief is." Mason raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Uh-huh, and you want us to take action because you're some sort of expert?" He smirked, leaning forward, almost mocking her confidence. The woman's expression didn't change. She was calm. Too calm, which made him even more doubtful. What was she really here for? To waste his time, like so many others before her? He sighed again, his patience thinning. "Look, we'll get to it when we can, but right now we have other cases to prioritize. Maybe come back later if you have more evidence." She stood there for a moment, her eyes locked onto his. Then, slowly, she handed him a small folder. "Take a look," she said softly, and without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the exit. Mason opened the folder, half expecting to find nothing but a few random notes. But what he found inside stunned him. Detailed reports, security footage, and precise notes outlining every break-in in the last few months. And there was something else, an official letterhead at the top of each page. He froze for a second, staring at the name printed on the top. It was familiar, but it didn't make sense. "Sarah Edwards," he muttered. "That can't be right." As he looked at the letterhead again, the pieces clicked together in an instant, and his heart sank. He didn't just mock a regular citizen, he had just insulted the new police chief. Mason's mind raced as he stared at the papers in his hands. He quickly glanced at the door, half expecting the woman to be standing there, watching him. But she was gone, leaving only the lingering memory of her calm demeanor and that name, Sarah Edwards. He rubbed his face in disbelief. The new police chief? How could he have been so blind? How could he have mocked her so carelessly? His palms began to sweat, and a tight knot formed in his stomach. The woman who had come in, dressed simply, who had spoken so matter-of-factly about the crimes in her neighborhood, she wasn't just some random person. She was someone important, someone he should have respected from the moment she walked in. He slammed the folder down on the desk, his earlier laughter now feeling like a cruel joke. What was I thinking? He scrambled to check his phone, quickly searching for Sarah Edwards' name. His breath hitched when he found multiple articles, each one more detailed than the last. Sarah Edwards had been appointed as the new police chief just a few weeks ago, a woman with a reputation for cracking down on corruption and incompetence within the force. Mason had heard whispers about her during the staff meeting a few days ago, but he hadn't paid much attention. In the back of his mind, she had seemed like another high-ranking official, someone whose name would come and go. He had no idea she was the one standing right in front of him, ready to make him pay for his arrogance. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Officer Daniels, a colleague of his. "Have you seen the news?" the message read. "The new chief is cracking down hard on anyone who doesn't take their job seriously. Watch your back." Mason's heart sank even further. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah Edwards had planned all of this. She had walked in knowing exactly how he would respond, testing him, watching him mock her, all the while gathering the very evidence that would make him look like a fool. He leaned back in his chair, his mind clouded with regret. There was no escaping the fact that he had made a huge mistake, and now he had to face the consequences. As if on cue, the door to his office creaked open. Mason's heart stopped when he saw her standing there again. Sarah Edwards, the woman he had mocked not an hour ago, now stood before him as the very person who could decide his fate. She didn't look angry, not in the way he had expected. Instead, she had a calm, composed look on her face, an expression that made him feel even more guilty. "I hope you had a chance to go through those documents," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I think you'll find that I'm not someone you want to underestimate." Mason opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He felt like a child caught in a lie, unable to defend himself. "I'll be reviewing all cases personally from now on," Sarah continued, her eyes cold but not unkind. "Including this one. If you're serious about keeping your job, I suggest you start taking these matters seriously as well, starting with respecting the people who come to you for help, no matter who they are." And with that, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving Mason to wonder just how much trouble he had gotten himself into. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Mason. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah Edwards walking out of his office, her back straight, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. He had hoped, for a moment, that it was all just a misunderstanding, that maybe she wasn't really the chief after all. But deep down, he knew better. The rumors around the precinct had already started to spread. Some of the officers were already talking about her, about how she had a reputation for being both tough and fair, someone who wouldn't hesitate to call out anyone who wasn't doing their job. Mason's mistake wasn't just an embarrassing moment, it was the beginning of something much bigger. He tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to Sarah. What would she do next? Would she fire him? Would she make an example out of him in front of the entire department? He had seen it happen before, to officers who made the mistake of underestimating the higher-ups. They were cast aside without a second thought, their careers ruined in an instant. It wasn't until the late afternoon that the call came in. Mason's stomach twisted as he glanced at his phone. It was from Sarah. She wanted to meet him in her office. "This is it," he thought, standing up from his desk. He tried to steady his hands as he straightened his uniform, trying to look as composed as possible. But inside, he felt like a wreck. When he walked into her office, the door closed behind him with a soft click. Sarah was sitting at her desk, flipping through some paperwork. She didn't look up at first, but Mason could feel her eyes on him, sharp and calculating. The silence between them stretched out for what felt like forever. "Have a seat, detective," she said, her voice businesslike but calm. Mason hesitated, then sat across from her. He could barely meet her gaze, the weight of his earlier actions hanging heavily in the air. "I've been going over the report you received this morning," Sarah continued, her tone neutral. "You're right. It's detailed. It's thorough. You didn't take it seriously, did you?" Mason swallowed hard, finally meeting her eyes. The calmness in her voice didn't match the storm inside his chest. I made a mistake, Chief," he said, his voice low. "I didn't realize who you were. Stop." Sarah raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't need an apology. I need you to understand what just happened here. This isn't just about respect. It's about the work we do. It's about protecting this community." "You laughed at me, detective. You didn't think I had anything important to say, did you? You dismissed me like I was just another citizen, wasting your time." Her words hit him like a slap. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that it wasn't personal, but he knew that was no excuse. He had been wrong. "I know you've been on this force for a long time," Sarah said, her gaze unwavering. "But I don't care how long you've been here. If you're not going to take your job seriously, then I won't hesitate to remove you. I've already seen your track record. I know what you're capable of. But I also know you're better than this." Mason's heart pounded in his chest. Was this it? Was she going to fire him right then and there? But instead of a dismissal, Sarah leaned forward, her voice softening slightly. "I'm giving you a chance to prove yourself, detective. Don't waste it. If you want to stay in this department, if you want to make things right, it starts with showing up. It starts with doing your job without prejudice, and it starts with respecting everyone, no matter their rank. Mason nodded, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. I understand, Chief. I won't let you down again, I promise. She studied him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, she stood up. Good. Now get to work. As Mason left her office, his mind was spinning. He had just been given a second chance, but the pressure weighed heavily on him. If he failed this time, there would be no coming back. But somehow he felt like he could do it. He had to prove that he was more than the man who had mocked the new chief. The next few days were a whirlwind for Mason. He worked with a newfound sense of urgency, determined to prove that he was capable of more than the careless detective Sarah had seen him as. Every case was handled with precision, every report double-checked. But the pressure was suffocating. Every time he crossed paths with Sarah, he couldn't help but feel like he was walking on eggshells. The tension between them was palpable, but she didn't give him a single moment of grace. She watched his every move, holding him accountable for even the smallest mistake. It was clear she was testing him, waiting to see if he would rise to the challenge or crumble under the weight of her expectations. One afternoon, as Mason was wrapping up a case, he heard Sarah's voice over the precinct's intercom. Mason, I need you to meet me in the conference room. Now. His stomach twisted. He had been doing everything right, hadn't he? His hands trembled slightly as he gathered his papers and walked to the conference room, but he had no idea what Sarah was planning now. When he stepped inside, Sarah was already waiting, standing by the whiteboard with a serious expression. There was a stack of files on the table, and Mason couldn't help but feel a sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. Close the door, detective, Sarah said, not looking up from the files. He obeyed, his footsteps loud in the otherwise silent room. When he turned to face her, he noticed something different in her eyes, something sharper, more calculating. The weight of the moment hung heavy between them, and for a second, Mason felt as though she was reading his every thought. I've been reviewing some of your recent work, Sarah said, still flipping through the files, and I have to say I'm impressed. You've turned things around, but there's one thing you're still missing. Mason's heart skipped a beat. Was this where she was going to tear him down again? He braced himself, ready for whatever criticism she had. You've been following the letter of the law, she continued, finally looking up at him. You've been doing everything right, checking all the boxes. But you're not thinking outside the box, Mason. You're not seeing the bigger picture. He frowned, unsure where she was headed with this. I assigned you to investigate a string of burglaries in a local neighborhood, Sarah continued. And while your reports have been thorough, I've noticed you've missed something important. She pointed to a map on the whiteboard. Take a look at this pattern. Mason walked closer, studying the map carefully. The locations of the break-ins were marked with red pins, forming an almost perfect circle. He had seen it before but hadn't given it much thought. You see it now, don't you? Sarah asked, her voice still calm but laced with an undeniable edge. These aren't random crimes. Someone is targeting these homes for a reason, and I'm betting you missed it. Mason's pulse quickened as the realization hit him. The pattern wasn't just about the break-ins, it was about something more, something deeper. He looked back at Sarah, a mix of surprise and regret in his eyes. I missed it, he admitted quietly. I didn't see the connection, but I will now. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. For a second, Mason wondered if she would write him off completely, if this was his final test and he had failed. But then she nodded, as if satisfied by his answer. Good, she said, her voice softening just a little. You're getting there. You've come a long way, Mason. But the real test is still ahead of you. You're not just solving cases, you're learning to think like a leader. And that's what this job requires. Now, get to work. Mason stood there for a moment, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if he'd passed some silent test, but he felt something shift inside him. He had come so close to losing everything. But now, he had a chance to prove that he was more than just a careless detective. As he left the room, a new sense of determination flooded through him. He was going to crack this case wide open, not because he had to, but because he had to prove to Sarah, and to himself, that he was worthy of the second chance she had given him. Mason didn't waste any time. That night, he pored over the case files, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the puzzle. The pattern was clearer now. The burglaries weren't just about stealing things. They were targeting specific homes. And there was something about the victims' profiles that he had missed before. The homes they targeted belonged to people who had recently come into significant wealth. Not from any known inheritance or lottery win, but small-time successes, like the sale of a business or a promotion to a high-paying job. It clicked. These weren't just random burglaries. They were carefully planned, and whoever was behind them knew exactly who to target. Mason felt a mix of frustration and excitement. How did I miss this? By the time dawn broke, he had compiled a list of potential suspects, each with a connection to the victims that he hadn't considered at first. It was all about timing. Each burglary had occurred right after the victim had experienced a significant change in their financial status. Whoever was behind it had access to personal information, knew when to strike. He had found the breakthrough, but now he had to act fast before the thief slipped away again. His phone buzzed just as he was finishing up his notes. "Meet me in my office, Mason. Now." Sarah's message read. The urgency in her words didn't give him a chance to think. He grabbed his jacket and rushed to her office, heart pounding. Was this another test? Had she figured it out already? When he entered, Sarah was standing by the window, her back to him. She turned as soon as he stepped in, and Mason couldn't help but feel the weight of her gaze on him. It was as if she could see right through him. "You've found something, haven't you?" she asked. Her voice calm but intense. Mason nodded, trying to keep his composure. He placed the files he had compiled on her desk, explaining his findings. The burglaries weren't random. They're targeting people who've recently had a financial gain. I've got a list of possible suspects. Sarah listened intently, her eyes never leaving him. When he finished, there was a long silence. Mason held his breath, waiting for her judgment. "Impressive," she said at last, her voice steady. "You've done your homework, Mason, I can see that." Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by the lingering anxiety. "So, what happens next?" Sarah looked thoughtful for a moment, her arms crossed. "Next, we act. We can't waste any time now. We need to bring this person in." Just as she spoke, her phone rang, cutting the tension in the air. Sarah glanced at the screen, her expression hardening as she answered. "Yes?" she said, her tone sharp. She listened for a moment before responding, her voice low but urgent. "Get the team together. We're moving now." She hung up, her gaze locking onto Mason's. "We've got a lead. The thief is making a move tonight. We're going in. I need you with me, detective." Mason's heart raced again. But this time it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. He wasn't going to let this chance slip through his fingers. He was ready. "Let's do it," he said, his voice steady, determined. They gathered the team quickly, moving through the precinct with a shared sense of purpose. As they prepared for the operation, Mason couldn't help but think about how far he had come. From the man who had mocked his new chief, to the one standing beside her, ready to take down the criminal who had nearly slipped through their fingers. The weight of the past few days had changed him. He was no longer just an officer following orders. He was part of something bigger. As they headed out, Sarah turned to him for the first time, offering a rare, approving nod. "You've proven yourself, Mason. Don't forget that." And with that, they headed toward the operation that would change everything, for both of them. The operation was fast-paced, and every second felt like an eternity. Mason's mind was sharp, focused on the task at hand. He was no longer worried about his past mistakes. Everything he had learned in the last few days, the lessons, the second chance Sarah had given him, were all leading him to this moment. They arrived at a quiet, suburban neighborhood just after dusk. The suspect's house was tucked between two larger homes, and from the outside, it looked completely ordinary. But Mason had learned never to judge a book by its cover, and right now, everything about this house felt wrong. It was too quiet, too well kept. Sarah turned to the team. "We go in on my signal. Keep it tight. We don't know what we're dealing with inside, so be prepared for anything." The tension in the air was thick. Officers moved into position, and Mason found himself beside Sarah, his nerves bubbling just beneath the surface. He could feel her calm determination, but it didn't make him feel any less anxious. He had to prove himself now, more than ever. "Ready?" Sarah whispered to him. He nodded. "Ready." The signal came, and the team moved swiftly, their footsteps muffled on the grass as they approached the front door. Sarah led the charge, and Mason was right behind her, his hand gripping his weapon with a sense of urgency. As they reached the door, Sarah gave one final nod to the officers stationed on either side. With a swift motion, she kicked the door open. The house was dark, but there was movement inside. Someone was definitely home. "Police!" Sarah called out, her voice commanding. "Get down on the ground now." The suspect, a man in his mid-40s, scrambled out from behind a corner, his hands raised in shock. Mason's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Sarah move in, her presence unwavering. But something about the scene didn't sit right. The man looked terrified, but not like someone caught in the act of a crime. He looked like he'd been expecting them, like he already knew what was coming. Sarah stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Where is it?" she asked. The man's eyes darted around the room, his breath quickening. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please, just don't lie to me." Sarah cut him off, stepping closer, her gaze sharp. "I know what you've been doing, and I know you were planning something tonight. Now tell me, where is it?" Mason was watching the exchange closely. He could see the fear in the man's eyes, but there was something else too. A quiet panic that suggested he wasn't just a thief, but someone much more dangerous. "I don't have it here," the man stammered. "It's at my storage unit. I was going to take it there, I swear." Sarah paused for a moment, then nodded at one of the officers. "Get the address. We're not done here." The tension didn't fade, but Mason couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency in Sarah's actions. There was more to this than just stolen goods. He could feel it. As they left the house, heading toward the storage unit, Mason felt a chill in the air. Sarah was more than just a leader. She was someone who saw things before they happened, who could read people and situations with a clarity that most didn't have. And for the first time, Mason truly understood why she was the chief. At the storage unit, things escalated quickly. The man had been lying, and as they opened the door to the unit, they found more than just stolen goods. There were files. A lot of files. They were marked with names and addresses, people who had been targeted, people whose personal lives had been violated in the most intimate way. "Sarah, this is bigger than we thought," Mason said, his voice low with realization. Sarah nodded, her face hardening. "This wasn't just about money, it was about information, and I think we've only scratched the surface." The atmosphere was tense as Sarah and the team stood around the storage unit, processing what they had just uncovered. Mason's mind was racing. This wasn't just about theft, it was about something far more sinister. The files in front of them, detailing personal information about the victims, were proof of that. Whoever was behind these crimes had been gathering intel on these people for months, maybe even years. Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. "Mason, get the team together. We need to secure this evidence and figure out who else is involved. This goes beyond just a few robberies. This is organized." Mason nodded quickly, moving to gather the officers and coordinate their next steps. The whole team was on high alert now. They weren't just solving burglaries, they were uncovering a conspiracy, one that had been hiding in plain sight. As they packed up the evidence, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he turned around, scanning the area. But there was nothing, just the shadows of the storage complex stretching out in the evening light. Still, the sensation of being followed lingered. By the time they returned to the precinct, Sarah had already set the wheels in motion to track down the full extent of the operation. There was no time to waste. Mason could see the determination in her eyes, the way she was compartmentalizing everything. Pushing forward, it was impressive, and for the first time in weeks, Mason felt like he wasn't alone in the fight. Sarah had proven herself to be not just a leader, but someone he could trust. As the hours stretched on, Mason worked alongside Sarah to go through the files. Every name, every detail, brought them closer to the true mastermind. They started connecting the dots between the stolen items and the individuals whose information had been stolen. It was clear that someone had been orchestrating all of this from the shadows. Finally, as dawn began to break, they had it. The person behind it all wasn't just a thief. They were someone high up in the department. Someone who had been using their position of power to access sensitive information and orchestrate the burglaries. It was a betrayal of the worst kind. Mason's blood ran cold when he saw the name on the list. It was a familiar one. Detective Armstrong, a senior officer who had been with the department for years. Mason had never suspected him, but now the pieces were falling into place. Armstrong had been moving in the background, pulling strings without anyone noticing. "Sarah," Mason said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "It's Armstrong. He's been behind all of this." Sarah's expression didn't change. She had already suspected as much. "We need to take him down, Mason, and we need to do it quietly. If this gets out before we have him, everything could fall apart." They made their plans carefully, knowing they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They gathered the evidence, prepared the arrest warrant, and set the trap. Armstrong had no idea what was coming. As they moved in to arrest him, Sarah's phone rang. She answered it quickly, her eyes narrowing as she listened. "They're moving," she said, hanging up the phone. "He knows we're coming for him. We need to hurry." The team mobilized, rushing to the location where Armstrong had been last seen. As they arrived, they saw him, a familiar face in the department, but now a criminal. Armstrong was standing outside, trying to make a getaway, a bag full of documents clutched in his hand. "Armstrong!" Sarah shouted, her voice loud and commanding. He froze, his eyes wide with panic as he realized what was happening. For a moment, there was silence, then he turned and tried to run, but it was too late. "Get down!" Sarah ordered as the team swarmed in, cornering Armstrong before he could escape. Mason watched as Armstrong was cuffed and brought to the ground, the weight of everything that had happened crashing down on him. It was over. The man who had orchestrated so much chaos, who had put so many lives at risk, was finally in custody. As Armstrong was led away in handcuffs, Mason looked at Sarah. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes. Something that told him this was just the beginning. "You did good, Mason," she said quietly, her voice steady. "You've earned your place here. Don't forget that." Mason nodded, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He had started out as a man who had underestimated Sarah, who had laughed at her presence. Now he stood beside her, no longer just an officer, but someone who had faced the darkness and come out on top. The story was over for now, but Mason knew that there would always be more challenges ahead. And whatever came next, he would be ready. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story and the twists along the way. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment to share your thoughts, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to stay updated on all the latest content. And of course, feel free to share with your friends. Let's get this story out there. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more exciting, dramatic tales. Thanks again.